Hello, this is a listening project specifically highlighting the women's voice within the game, brought to you by the Football Supporters Association and Offside Media Productions. In this 6-part series, leaders of football fan groups and other trailblazers are joining me, Lynsey Hooper, to chat about the big issues facing fans right now. Today's episode is all about the relationship between the men's and women's game. Joining me for this one, it's Debs Dilworth, the FSA Women's Game Network Manager. Hello, Debs.
Hello.
Got Nick Andrews-Gauvain, the Wolves women representative at Wolves Trust. Hello, Nick.
Hello, Lynsey.
Anika Leslie-Walker, a senior lecturer in Sports Sociology at Nottingham Trent University.
Hi, Lynsey.
And also Chris Paouros, co-chair of Proud Lilywhites, FSA board member and season ticket holder for Spurs men and women. Hello to you, Chris. I know I've seen you on my travels before. You are a regular at both men's and women's games. So I'll start with you. What are the key differences that you notice, first of all, from a fan perspective?
Well, there's a question. I mean, I've been a Spurs men's season ticket holder for 25 years, but the first time I went to Spurs when I was 6. So I'm very well I'm steeped in men's football in that sense. And I've been going to football all my life and I love it. But I was really excited to be able to have the opportunity to even buy a season ticket for the women's game, for Spurs women. I first watched Spurs women in the early 2000s. They were called Tottenham Hotspur Ladies in those days. They weren't associated directly with the football club. They had some sort of funding and a bit of kit, but they were a separate organisation with a separate, board, etc. And my late wife used to play for them. So we went all around the country watching her play, which was brilliant. And it was incredible, as you can imagine, for me as a Spurs fan to be able to do that. Fast forward, I think, to I'm going to get my dates wrong now. 16 or 17, and Spurs women, as they were then called, I think, played at White Hart Lane and beat West Ham to be promoted to the Championship. Yes, it was to what was then the Championship, which was really exciting, actually. And I just want to give a little shout out to to Spurs women, because they're the first team to get into the WSL on sporting merit, to find themselves working their way up through the pyramid into the WSL, because of course the WSL was created, if you like. And look, that's not a criticism. I think the WSL is doing amazing things for women's football. As a fan, it's really interesting in terms of what that difference is. For all the things that I love about football, as a woman football fan, it can often be a challenge. I go to a lot of away games and, I've considered in the past wearing headphones so I don't have to hear the vitriol from my fellow fans around me, whether that's, homophobia, misogyny, just general anger and whatever. It's like I'm not there for that. Like, I love things to be a bit crunchy, don't get me wrong. It's not about it being all kind of stickers and glitter and rainbows, but actually it doesn't have to be that angry, I think. And that's one of the things that I love about the women's game, is that you've got being a fan of the women's game, you've got brilliant rivalry, like really good competition, but somehow culturally it's sort of done in the right way. It's like you can have the rivalry, but like the fan culture is something brilliant. And I think there's something about that's about a game that has kind of grown up on the margins. And, and you've got a lot of fans who have been players themselves, etc., and sort of understand what that is. So I think that's my sort of initial.
Yeah, I'll just pick up on what Chris was just saying there about sort of going to the games. Certainly, I'm a dad. I've got 2 8-year-olds. I feel comfortable just taking my kids to the women's game. I know they're going to be safe. There's not going to be any issues. They're not going to hear that the sort of homophobic language that Chris was talking about. That sort of the hate that's there at times at the men's game. Don't get me wrong. We'll take them, but I'll just try and make sure they're not hearing some of that the worst of that you hear of, that vitriol, as Chris describes it, in the men's stadium. Whereas I know, I can literally take them into the gates at New Bucks Head for Wolves, or away games, and just sort of say, right, you two can go over there, watch the game. engage with the players at the end. There's no issue. They're safe. And I think there's part of it is safety as well there. So yeah, I think that's, for me, that's part and parcel. It's as a family event. It's much nicer, safe environment.
I think that's right. The one thing you've got to be careful of, I think, in that is that you don't end up with a game that's too sanitised, because then you're falling into Anika will know better than me because it's her job, but you're falling into kind of sort of like gendered stereotypes of it all being very nice and safe when women are involved in sporting endeavour, and like a bigger, something else when it's men.
Well, let's get Anika's professional view then.
Yeah, I think as a fan of the women's football and men's football, I attend championship fixtures in the Northwest, and in terms of me as a black woman in a stadium, I feel, it's a great experience, but I definitely do hear some gender stereotypes about women being fans, being in the stadium, some of the language that's used sometimes, we have to challenge that. So that's one point. But just moving on to what Nick said around the actual atmosphere of women's football, I think we've got to be really, it's actually quite a hard balance now, following on from the Euros where, the England squad did very well and it attracted a different type of fan. We obviously want to ensure it's inclusive for families to attend, ensure it's a safe environment. But now we've got the sponsorship come in, and the game's developing so quickly. So it just depends on how we want the WSL league to actually develop, because if we want there to be similarities to the men's game, Chris spoke about funding, infrastructure, that does then start to attract a different type of fan as well.
And Debs, from your FSA point of view, one of the things that I wanted to raise was the travel to the stadiums, because having attended both myself, the infrastructure that was there, certainly with railways and networks, it's all around the men's stadium. So it's pretty easy to get there, to get back. I say pretty easy. That's if everything's running okay, of course. But then you look at the women's stadiums. I mean, even if we just take that top part of the pyramid, the WSL, and you look at somewhere like Leigh Sports Village, which is very difficult to get to for Manchester United fans, that's not a one-off example. I wonder the comparison of what you've made of that and what your members have made of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think travel is always a hot topic in and amongst our Women's Game Network members, and can be very difficult to get to stadiums and different kickoff times. So particularly the 6:45 on a Sunday at this moment in time is extremely difficult for a number of supporters. Even if you wanted to go by a coach, some of the fixture times are really difficult if you have to rely on public transport in order to get to those fixtures, to the coach point in order to get to the fixtures. So I think that's one of the key differences with the women's game, is the ease of transport and travel and accessibility. And then you almost as a supporter have to fight to get to the game still. That is changing slightly, but just picking up on a couple of points from Chris, Nick and Anika, the key differences in the women's game is we always seem to be comparing back to the men's game, when actually what we should be doing is creating an entirely different model, which is football. So we just need to be kind of mindful of that, I think, going forwards. And I think a lot of our women's game members would also support that view as well.
I think that's a great shout, Debs, because it's one of the, this is a hypothesis. I've got nothing on which to base this, but I think certainly off the back of the Euros, I think there's a whole audience for women's football that isn't necessarily men's football fans. And I think, if you're going to build a game, we've got a whole new audience that we can develop, and a whole new set of match-going fans that aren't necessarily... I know loads of women who have got involved, who've never been interested in football before, who are really up for watching women's football for all sorts of reasons. And I think that's the audience we should be looking at, and that's who we should be building the game for.
Just on a couple of points too, is that sometimes it's the phrasing or phraseology that we use in and around the women's game. And so I'm quite troubled, and I was just saying this the other day to one of our network members, I'm quite troubled by we're going to play in a men's stadium. We're going to play in a men's stadium, because if you look across like the history of women's football and the dispensability of it, or the homelessness feel of women's football, by using these big stadiums, the men's stadiums, are we actually going putting the women's game at a disadvantage, because it just plays into this dispensability nature of women's football? So should we not instead of trying to get into these men's stadiums, be actually looking to get secure homes for all the women's teams and filling those out? So I'm troubled by that a little bit, but I know other people really enjoy the experience of the men's stadiums. But again, the phrasing of it is just troubling to me because we're saying men's. It belongs to the men, but the women are borrowing it.
You use the word phraseology, Debs. I wanted to talk about that because when Chris originally opened and started talking about how she got involved with the women's game as well as the men's, you were talking about Spurs ladies, and then we've seen a lot of the teams drop the word ladies. But I think there's a wider issue here in terms of identification. And it's one which I'm really intrigued by what you think, all of you collectively. I mean, maybe we start with Anika on this. I'm sure you'll have done a bit of research, but in Olympic sports, in hockey, for instance, Anika, you wouldn't have men's hockey, women's hockey. It's just hockey. But we do identify men's football. We don't even say men's football. Men have football. It's just football and women's football, isn't it? And if you do a Google search and you put a team in, the men's squad will come up. You've got to add the word women to find anything out about the women. Is that problematic? And what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I think it's definitely problematic. Shouldn't always instantly think of the male game and the male gaze to some extent. Obviously, when we think about gender-based sports such as netball, feminine-based sports, we never think about the gender balance. So I think, unfortunately, the current century, we have to consider women's football. But I think we need to move away from that and just have, Man City women's ladies, for example. I just wanted to go back though, Lynsey. I know you've highlighted a point there, but just going back to Chris's point around the experience of fans. She mentioned that obviously having the structure of women's football is great, but I've spoken to some friends that went to the Euros, and I think we're missing the point there where we're comparing the men's game to the women's, because actually, as Chris has mentioned, there is a huge number of people that want to follow the women's game, but the fan experience is very similar to the men's game, but we need to change it. So the FSA are doing great work around fan zones, but I watch many sports, and if I think about when I go to a netball match or if I go to the 100 with the cricket, in terms of the fan experience, it's very different to what I experienced at the Euros. So I think we've kind of already engaged some new fans, like Chris has said, but it's about what more we can do to try and bring in best practice from other sports as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting because does football in inverted commas, think that it doesn't have to do that work because it's already got a monopoly, if you like, on its audience. And I think the point here is that there are more people that can engage with football, and let's think about really how we can do that and like make it brilliant and joyous and get more people, like all those things that we love about it. In the end, the thing that I love the most about football is being in a stadium with I don't know however many people it is, and like just as the ball's flying through the air and hitting the back of the net, that collective feeling where everyone stands up at the same time, cheers at the same time, has that intake of breath at the same time. You couldn't choreograph it if you tried. And that is just magic. And that feeling of belonging and that you believe in something that's like bigger than you and all of those things. And it's like, that is something that loads of other people, I'm sure, would love to be involved in, but have never felt like it's accessible. Well, actually, we can make it accessible. And I think that's really exciting. And like the brilliant thing there is as well, if I think, Nick touched on it with talking about your daughters, is that the players are accessible in a certain way as well. So, and like are conscious of their responsibility as role models. And so, there's something about being able to go to a game and then actually, go and have a chat to a player afterwards as well. And it's an additional thing that you don't want the game to lose because it's unique to the women, to the women's game. And I think that's a really nice thing from a fan perspective.
Do you think that's something that could be adopted again from the men's? Because we've also got to talk about the lessons that the men's game can learn from the women's, or are we past that?
I think that is something that could be replicated in the men's game for sure. So I'm a Preston fan, and one of my bugbears really at the end of the game is that the players barely even do the perimeter of the field, just to, even high five kids or whatnot, or just come and talk to supporters. Now, they will do that in different ways, and I'm not criticising just Preston, but it just would be good to see a bit more of that connection with the supporters that's not far away. Now, on the other side of things, you want to make sure there's a respectful boundary and stuff. And I think this is where, again, you're going into, Anika sure would have a view on this, but the territory of what's expected from an athlete that's a woman as opposed to an athlete that's a man, in how they have to act and behave. So if they've just come off of the back of a 5-0 loss, and they're then expected to go and talk to supporters, the athletes that are women are expected to do that in a different way, a more tolerant way. So then are we again playing into these gender stereotypes? So it's something that needs to be thought through perhaps a little bit more.
Yeah, just picking up on Chris's sort of earlier point, spot on. That you completely that. I just want to correct on one thing. I've got a son and a daughter. I take both of them to the game, and they both look up to the players as role models. My son was having banter with Shan Turner, the Wolves women goalkeeper. My daughter was talking to Destiny Toussaint, the winger. It doesn't matter to them; they're Wolves players.
Yeah, just on that point, Nick, I think, like you say with your children, I think it's great that they can access athletes because they're role models. We would hope as well that they've got a reliability to be role models in the environment. I think if we pose that question to some men's clubs, whether they could do that, I think, like you say, that one, the security, two, the boundaries, three, the professionalisation, sponsors, etc. There's numerous issues that will arise. But then we have to think, actually, Debs mentioned earlier around the positioning of gender in this. So because women are supposed to be, the ones that are supposed to be more maybe front face, maybe more, it's great
more
that
amiable.
They do it. Yeah, exactly. It's great that they're able to be accessible, but at the same time, there's a real counterplay of gender in this. So I don't know what the answer is on that one. I would love for the game to stay accessible, but I do think in terms of commercialisation, professionalisation, boundaries will come in place as soon as the game starts to grow even further than what it currently stands.
I think that this also kind of plays into the fact of are we following a bit of a faulty model? So is this a golden opportunity? And maybe the train has already gone slightly down the track because we've got a bigger broadcast deal, etc., etc. But are we following a faulty model instead of trying to sort of think outside the box and be more creative in some of the ways in which we're trying to position women's football? Now, that's not to say that, I think there's a lot of grateful people for the broadcast deal that was signed because it's given a visibility, it's given a sort of professionalism in terms of how the players are viewed on TV, etc., etc. So there is a good side to it, but equally it's caused a lot of problems in terms of match-going fans. Are we creating these superstars? Is that then going to change the accessibility? There's a lot of sort of we've just gone, oh, well, the men have got a big broadcast deal, so that's what the women have to have in order to be successful. Why are all our successful check boxes based on the men's model? There's just so many other models that you could think about and different ways to do it.
I take your point, Debs, and I agree with you that are we following a faulty model? But in the same way, what I don't want to do is because we've got a moral imperative about this or a fan imperative that says, you know what, I don't want to have to make the fans be somewhere at 4:30 on a Sunday because, it's not 4:30 on a Sunday, is it? Because that's where the men's slot is. We don't want the fans to be somewhere at 6:30 on a Sunday. But then you're basically asking women to sacrifice their economic capabilities because we want to find some kind of pure model for women to sort of work by. So it's a complicated conundrum, this. I guess as a fan, what I want to do is love watching Spurs as much as possible and love watching the Spurs women's team and sometimes more. I hate to say that. I should probably, it's my personal views, not the views of any organisation of which I support.
Would you therefore be in favour of a double header? And I know we can bring Nick in for this as well, seeing as you go to both. Is that something you'd like to see? Both games happening on the same day after each other?
It's got to be done right. Talking to Sunderland fans after they'd just done it recently, there are lessons to be learned, shall we say, from how they did it there and or what they didn't do there in the marketing. You've got to have the timing was wrong, as in so much they had 90 minutes between the end of one game and the beginning of the next. You can't have that. Fans will get bored of sitting around it for 90 minutes. 15, 20 minutes between games, that's fine. But then stadiums aren't designed to have two sets of changing rooms. So who's immediately in the less good changing rooms or whatever. So there's conversations to be had there. Principle sounds great. And I think it'd be a really good one, especially if you did men's first, women's second. So therefore it's the stay on into and go and watch, because you've filled people will stay, and it's advertised and it's promoted as two games. But I think it's a logistical nightmare. I think at the minute is that one of the issues there we've got to see. And I think, as I said, looking at what Sunderland have done recently, where they have done that double header, and as I said, talking to Sunderland fans who were there, it didn't quite work out as well as they intended because of the time in between games and the lack of promotion.
Apparently there was 500 or so new eyeballs though at that game. So it just sounds actually creepy in some senses that it was just the eyeballs, but so yeah, in that respect, is any new eyeball good, because at least it's one more set of eyes that's on the game, which so like that's the benefit of maybe doing these things. So I'll stop talking about eyeballs now. Sorry.
I just wonder whether, and I'm conscious Anika wants to dive in as well. Just so I'll show off after this. The money and effort that was put into that went into that whole having that double header. If that money was put instead to promoting and investing a bit more into the infrastructure at wherever the stadium is that their team plays, take it away from being Sunderland at the minute, but into that, and actually properly invested and properly marketed the women's team, then actually would that you get those 500 eyeballs into the games more regularly as well. And it's not just about one-off attendance; it's about regular match-going attendance.
I think Nick's point about the logistics is interesting, because we did a double header at Spurs in a pre-season game last season, and so the men's team played first, and then the women's team played, and it was really well priced. It was a nice sunny day because it was pre-season, but the numbers dropped markedly. And that was a real shame. And it wasn't because it wasn't marketed properly and all the rest of it. It's just that you just, it kind of really illustrates to me that there is potentially a different audience. However, having had the summer that we've just had with the Euros, I do wonder whether if that pre-season game happened after the Euros, whether the numbers would have dropped so much. I think we're slightly in a different moment now for women's football, having just delivered, the greatest achievement in English football for in 60 years. So I think there is an opportunity to capitalise on it, whether it's a men's fans or not. So I'd be interested to see how that might look in the future, and if they're competitive games.
Well, we've raised a few issues there. I'm going to let you, Nick, Debs and Chris, have a think about potential thought that you'd like to leave or solution from men's and women's, and one of the key changes you'd like to see. Anika, I want to bring you in just before we go about the lack of BAME role models, because this is something that you've researched into. So this is among female players in contrast to the men's game, where there are many more. What have your findings been?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult one. We can't really compare the men's game to the women's game in this aspect, is what I would say. However, I think in terms of the lack of visibility of Black, Asian and other minority ethnic groups on the field, it's a real challenge. I think the FA structures have changed over the last 5 to 10 years. If we go prior back, where we used to have, Anita Asante, Eni Aluko, Leanne Sanderson, and others, we had a lot of diversity, but it seems to have flipped. Now, I think potentially because the FA might be focusing on different talent structures and so forth, that may have ensured that certain potentially social class groups, but also those from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds, may not have been able to access the system. So at this stage, it is a problem. We can see that visibly in the Euros. If you look at the playing time of those players from mixed race backgrounds, particularly who are on the field of play, it was minimal. It's changed a little bit in some of the matches post Euros, but it is a problem. It's specifically a problem for me because young girls coming up from those backgrounds aren't seeing role models. And when you don't have these role models, it's really difficult to picture yourself in that position. I think the PFA are doing some great work around visibility. The work of Fern Whelan as well at the PGL, there's lots of great work going on, but is it too late? It is at the moment, I'd say, for the World Cup. I know some players have been added to the squad, but then we also have to think about that positioning of, I'm not saying it's tokenism, but there is an audience that are suggesting it's tokenism. So it's a real fragile piece of work, I would say. I'll finish there, Lynsey.
Okay, and we'll get a quick final thought from the other three. Debs first.
Yes, so I would like to see sort of the men's game learning from the women's game as much as possible, because I think there's some really fantastic, beautiful things that are in and around the women's game. I also would agree or echo a point that Nick raised in terms of putting money into infrastructure and to sort of try to push against the dispensability or homelessness feel sometimes that is involved in the women's game. So for me, playing at the men's stadiums isn't necessarily the way to go. I would rather women's teams and the women's game to have homes, have that be invested in. Or if you're going to play at the men's stadium, then it be a joint stadium and the whole stadium structure change, which is maybe a little bit idealistic, but I kind of think that actually it needs to be completely integrated or not just borrowed every now and then because there's an opening. So that would be something that I would like to see.
Nick?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's that investment. It's investment in the physical sort of infrastructure and support, making teams feel at home, but also that investment in the marketing. Plug your team, plug your women's team as though it was your men's team. And I think I said it in an interview I did with Talking Woso. I think the question that every decision you make is for the women's team is, would you do this for the men's team? And if not, why not? And vice versa is every decision you make with the men's team, would you do this with the women's team? If not, why not? So it's that having that mindset about how you're promoting, how you're dealing with, how you're managing your teams. It's, there's a mindset that needs to be changed within football club governance. And I think that's the one thing I'd like to see changed. And that goes across the board both ways.
On the stadia point, which I wasn't going to necessarily say, but I think to Deb's point, it's like, I like to think of it as not borrowing anything, because if it's the club stadium and the club has a men's and a women's team, then it's just as much a women's stadium as a men's stadium. But that's just an ideological point. I think in terms of what we should be doing, we should be building new audiences. I think that really makes a difference, that can then enable and shore up the women's fan culture that we've got in this country, because there is a women's fan culture. And then I think to Anika's final points there, I think as a game from the governing body's perspective, which I know the FA is working on, doing that real work in ensuring that there are real pathways for black and brown girls to develop how they play football and ensure that we do have role models in the future. Because I agree with you, I think it's too late for the World Cup, because we can't just pretend that there isn't this dearth of players for a number of reasons. I think Anita Asante's article in The Guardian was brilliant, so I'm not going to paraphrase that. Go and look at that, because Anita did a great piece there. But I think that's also important, because I think, we need to build a game that's for all of us, not just for some of us.
We are going to have to bring this discussion to a close, but it's been fascinating listening to you all. Thank you so much. A big thank you to Debs, Nick, Anika and Chris. If you've been listening in at home and you want to share your views, you can comment below or get in touch on social media at We Are the FSA. Keep a lookout for the other Listening Project episodes too, covering a wide range of topics, including female voices and safety at matches. There's one released every week for 6 weeks, and it's here to provoke thought, hopefully generate some solutions going forward as well. Take care and see you soon.